Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the comeback album from the pop group titled Citizen Zombie. So okay, back a couple days ago when I talked about the Mavericks comeback and reviewed their album Mono, it was at least a comeback that could be easily explained. The group had split apart amicably, it had only been a decade, and there's a growing market for old-fashioned country music in the wake of bro country's ascendance. It kinda makes sense why they take a shot at it and continue releasing albums. If only the resurgence of the pop group made that much sense. I mean, I have to ask, was there really the demand? I mean, sure, post-punk has returned more to the spotlight in recent years, especially in the indie scene, but the pop group weren't exactly a traditional post-punk group, at least however you could define that nebulous genre. I mean, while they might have kept the clear, striking guitar textures and the deep, washed-out mix that was common at the time, it could easily be argued that the pop group had more in common with funk, crossed with free jazz, dub, avant-garde spoken word, and noise than most post-punk, and as such they got a lot of critical acclaim and were held as influential by no-wave acts like Swans, to noise acts like Sonic Youth, to other post-punk groups like The Birthday Party, which eventually spawned Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. But the pop group has always seemed to have a very ramshackle approach that barely seems sustainable for a few songs, let alone the 2 albums that they managed to release in the later half of the 70s. And you know what? I have to admit, of the post-punk of that era, the pop group is a band that I appreciate a lot more than I like. Many of their songs had great elements that fired off in all sorts of weird directions, don't get me wrong here, but cohesion was always a problem. And it makes sense considering the band was comprised of a group of teenagers that had more talent and imagination than real cooperation between them. It certainly explained a lot of the lyrics, which had some evocative, powerful imagery, but definitely uneven writing across those records. Internal fighting eventually split the band apart, with the members eventually joining several other punk bands until 2010. 30 years later, where the talk of the band's reunion started. It took another 5 years, 35 years in total, until Citizen Zombie was finally released. So I took a look. How is it? Well, here's the thing. If you're expecting this comeback album to remotely resemble their previous records, you're in for a harsh surprise, because Citizen Zombie takes the pop group's ramshackle approach to music and rams it through not only the distinctly unique production style of Paul Epworth, but then a half dozen mid-80s anarcho-punk records and late 80s industrial albums. What results is a record that is at least interesting, I'll give it that, but is it good? Well, in this case, I think it's a matter of expectations. Those expecting a second wide, they're inevitably going to be disappointed, but those entering this record with a cleaner slate will find it mostly agreeable, but in a strange way probably a little bit underwhelmed. That's probably where my opinion falls on Citizen Zombie. It's not a bad album, let me stress this, but you know what, the more times that I listen through it, the more times that I wish that I liked it a lot more than I do, so they're saying that. So let's start with the instrumentation, where the biggest changes are visible, and if I was asking for more cohesion from the pop group, I did get it. There are more straightforward, structured songs on this album, with verses and choruses and even some halfway decent melodic hooks filtering in through the fuzz. Hell, you can make the argument that the band swapped out more of their funkier sides for fragments of dance punk and industrial music with their rollicking guitars and bass lines. Hell, in a twisted way, the poppier sides of the pop group on this album are actually where they score some of their better tracks. At least the moments that don't grate on my nerves in the same way. Granted, that was all part of the point. It's very clear that the dissonant elements of the pop group, they're still determined to make this album as hard of a listen as possible, albeit nowhere near as hard as you might expect, which is the first element that really threw me off guard about this record. Most of this is a factor of Paul Epworth's production, which seemed to add a thin, muting layer to anything with real visceral sizzle or power. So the abrasive elements don't really come through in the distortion, but in the melodic dissonance or conflicting elements in the mix that feels a lot more dense and thick than on previous records. And really, if I'm being honest, that's a lot more grating to listen through than pure raw crunch. Really, the most distortion comes through is on the fuzz, reverb, and effects that's piled onto Mark Stewart's vocals, which makes his half-growled, half-shouted lyrics even harder to make out, and since nobody posts the lyrics online, that's a real problem for me. Now, that's not saying that there aren't instrumental moments on this album that I did like. The eerie, shambling shriek of the title track, the slick groove of Mad Truth, the shifted Nowhere Girl from a typical punk intro to this slow, noisy, seething smash that actually managed to balance out the backing chorus and the waves of synth surprisingly well, the bouncy guitar lick of s.o.p.h.i.a that almost reminded me of a Franz Ferdinand or Modest Mouse song, and then the wobbling synth against the eerie squeals of guitar on the spoken words track Nations. Hell, even though I don't really think the piano was especially well integrated into the harsher tracks on this album, I actually didn't mind it on Age of Miracles. It's probably the most fragmented and most spacious track on the record, the most reminiscent of Why, and actually benefits from having a thin backbone in the piano and the percussion. Or on Echelon, which goes for a slower, more operatic swell with hazy guitar, reedy pipe organ, and even howling sax near the back of the mix. Hell, if I were looking for one area that's almost universally good on this album, it would probably be in the percussion lines, which doesn't surprise me considering they're called the pop group and it's somewhat more reminiscent of modern pop, because they all tend to have a lot of dripping texture, cacophonous presence, and a lot of variety in their progressions. The one area where the production isn't nearly as good is in the backing vocals, mostly because the female vocals they chose for tracks like the Immaculate Deception, they're just a little bit too thin and clean to really blend well with this album. They just don't fit really well at all. But of course, all this circles back to the lyrics. And look, I'm well aware that the pop group were never really a hugely lyrical band. The lines were blunt, they were frequently overwrought, and they earned a lot of their impact thanks to a blend of teenage angst and raw passion. But now, 35 years later, one would expect they wouldn't rely so much on lyrical broadsides that feel cliched even for anarcho-punk music. A lot of this album is in a hurry to get to the chorus, and comparing larger society to zombies or robots spiraling out of control, thrashing religion as an opiate of the masses, even co-opting game show metaphors, I'm sorry, just feels kinda tired and overdone. Maybe in the 90s it could've worked a little bit better, but game shows, really? It really brings the lyrical nuance or sheer power to make up for it. Hell, even though I'd argue the spoken word piece Nations is easily the best track on this album, it still cribs parts of its overarching message and lyrics from Trainspotting, which came out nearly 20 years ago. But then again, on the other hand, just because the references are overplayed, does it mean that the overall message of the album is? I mean, thematically, this is a record that's trying to shock the system out of apathy and stupor, and fuse it with whatever spark it can, be it the spark of wild love or the fire of social revolt. And say what you will about the pop group, for the most part, they do sustain some level of populism and really connecting with their audience and not talking down to them. The only parts where they really do are the religious pot shots taken on Immaculate Deception and Insane Outrageous, and really, they're the worst songs on this album. But circling back to Nations, what I really do like about that song comes in the final seconds where the topic circles back to addiction with the lyric, "I was contextualized in relation to these things." It puts the mess of this album to sharper context, as the pop group's broad grab bag of subjects they ring of any possible desire in order to connect with the audience, to snap somebody free, to cause that miracle, and they're stretching as broad as possible. Because with the closing track Echelon, the stakes become a lot sharper, because it's the first song on this album that really addresses the band's return to the spotlight. Both grateful for those precious few who managed to get the message, and kind of mournful the fact that so many more will just ignore it, leaving dissonant melodies to echo in a haunted dance hall never heard. So yeah, in the end, you know what, this is an album that's really hard for me to rate. Placed against the pop group's early discography, and while it is more cohesive, it doesn't have the same spark of wild energy or rawness that made them fascinating to me. But the band knows that to some extent, and it's trying whenever they possibly can to reforge that connection. And whether you like this album or not will come down to whether or not you believe they pulled this off. For me, I gotta be honest, I miss the energy and the funky, jazzier edge on the lyricism that took more chances than they do here. So for me, it's a very strong 6 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation. I won't say it's a perfect comeback album, there were better ones this year, but I definitely do see its appeal. If you got a taste for the weirder side of post-punk or whatever you call this, definitely give Citizen Zombie a look. You won't be disappointed. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.